If you didn't enjoy Final Fantasy XVI's base game, you will not enjoy the DLC either. But the DLC shows that the developers heard and listened to the negative feedback surrounding FF16. And thus, a lot of issues or things people didn't like have been largely addressed in Echoes of the Fallen. There's actual banter around Clive, Joshua and Jill. Gear is much more interesting and reminiscent of an RPG, at least when it comes to your accessories. And most importantly, the game is actually pretty damn challenging. The final boss of this DLC is harder than everything we have in the base game. The fights are a lot deeper on a mechanical level, and in some ways it actually feels like an MMO. And please, don't be alarmed, I mean this in a good way. I personally think that the quality of the content in this DLC is a cut above the rest compared to what we have in the base game. There were no iconic fights involved, but somehow it still manages to be an absolute spectacle. Very much on the same level of Titan or Bahamut. If any of this sounds interesting to you, then allow me to share my experience with Echoes of the Fallen, while trying my best to avoid spoiling the major things. Before we even start the DLC, I want to make something clear. In order to access it, you first have to be at the final quest in the game, and you also need to have completed a few side quests. Once that is done, you will be sent off on a little journey, which then culminates with a dungeon you will explore. The main bulk of the DLC happens within said dungeon. I should also mention, it's not a very long DLC. You can complete it in maybe 3 hours, even 2 if you're quick. Regardless, as I mentioned in the intro, this dungeon will be tackled by you, playing as Clive, with Joshua and Jill accompanying you. There's a lot of great moments all the way to the end, and even if you're not going to play this, I recommend at least watching a playthrough of it, if you're into the lore or if you like the characters. Now, as much as I would want to talk about this thing in specific, I'm afraid I have to avoid it for the time being, simply because it would lead to some very heavy spoilers. Instead, let's just talk about gear and loot. Like I mentioned in the intro, gearing is going to become much better. Admittedly, your weapon and armor is still pretty boring. They are just a stat stick and offer nothing else. One thing to note is that the gear you obtain from the DLC is way better than almost everything you get in the base game. To be honest, this was one of my pet peeves. You work hours completing side quests in order to obtain a legendary quality item that will then get replaced 20 minutes into the DLC. On a brighter note, let's talk about accessories for a while. I think pretty much everyone is going to agree that the base game accessories kind of suck. Not that they are bad necessarily, but they just aren't very exciting. Of course, there have been some exceptions like the Berserker ring, but the truth is that the vast majority of the other accessories have just been boring. Either a cooldown reduction or a slight damage increase. This entire concept is thrown out the window with the DLC. You get a few accessories that all serve a vastly different purpose. For example, there's one that actively heals you. There's one that reduces your cooldowns if you get a perfect dodge. There's one that makes parrying easier. There's one that increases your stagger damage multiplier. There is one that makes your limit break heal more, and if you receive fatal damage you instead automatically use your limit break. And my favorite of the bunch, one that allows you to jump multiple times on top of an enemy. Up to 6 times to be exact. Fun fact by the way, back in July I was reviewing the game. I had this to say. And another thing that kind of bothers me is that you can jump on top of enemies, but unfortunately that is limited to only 2 jumps at most, which honestly is not really enough, at least as someone who has been, again, a huge DMC fan who spends almost the entire combat in air. Kinda wasn't the best, just being this limited, but again, it doesn't change the fact that the combat itself is extremely fun. I did not think that they would add an item which would actually make aerial combat better. But lo and behold, to be honest, this was the best thing that came out of the DLC for me. My biggest complaint regarding combat was solved with this one little accessory, and I am forever grateful for that. Let's ask the obvious question though. Are these going to impact the meta builds and make a drastic shift in what accessories people are going to use? Most likely, no, at least not all of them. But I don't think that's a problem. Most people are only going to play for fun anyway. And what's more fun? 5% damage, or jumping 6 times on top of someone. Again, this is something that comes down entirely to preference, but I genuinely think that accessories are amazing. And lastly, let's talk about the fights. You will be surprised by the enemy variety here. You will face a lot of enemies that appear in the base game, however they will look slightly different and have an array of new abilities. I thought that the changes done to these mobs was just cosmetic, so you can guess how surprised I was to see new attacks. It goes without saying, I was surprised by how punishing they are too. Difficulty was also something that many people complained about, and to be honest, I'm someone who does agree with that. I don't think difficulty is something that affects the quality of a game, but people do enjoy a fair and fun challenge. I mean, that's why games like Devil May Cry or Dark Souls are so popular. And let no one tell you otherwise, this DLC was tough. I only completed it in the action-focused mode, since I don't have it unlocked on my higher level save. But even on the easier difficulty I had moments where I had to heal, something I almost never did on my first playthrough. If you're worried that the only reason this DLC is hard because the enemies deal a lot of damage, rest assured that's not entirely true. Simply put, the enemies have better movesets with some actually dangerous combos that will require your constant focus. There are 4 mini-bosses and 1 main boss, and they are all vastly different from each other and unique in their own way. I've mentioned in the beginning that there are some boss mechanics that are very much similar to those you would see in an MMO. If you want to skip over this section, since I will have some spoilers, I got a timestamp on the screen right about now. Or if you want to listen without seeing what's going on, just close your eyes, I guess. For example, this mini-boss has an attack where it starts to spin. After a few seconds, it stops, and now you have to get to the safe area in order to avoid damage. Simple enough, right? As the fight goes on, you will have clones spawning and doing different attacks during the spin phase, which will then make the fight progressively harder. So think of it as a soft enrage timer. You gotta kill it before it kills you. Again, this is just a mini-boss, and this is just one attack that I've wanted to use as an example. Believe me when I say the main boss is on a completely different level of insanity. I just want to spare you any visual or mechanic related spoilers when it comes to that. But anyhow, that about sums up the DLC. I think it's awesome, a solid 8 or 9 out of 10 in my honest opinion. The only thing I wish was different is the length. If it was, say, at least 5 or 6 hours with this level of quality, it would easily be a 10 out of 10 for me. In any case, if you enjoyed the base game, I think you will absolutely love the DLC. If you hated the base game, avoid getting this. Maybe get it once it's on discount if you want to try it out. But otherwise, I don't think you should be worried about getting it. Thank you guys for watching. I hope all of you are feeling great. And I will see you again soon. Take care, everybody.